Given the typically inclement conditions the country enjoys most of the year, you'd think the UK wouldn't have a problem with water. It might not grow on trees, but it does fall from the skies with alarming regularity. And yet, raw sewage is dumped into our rivers and seas with even greater frequency. In 2022, on average, 824 times. A day, that is. But where there's muck, there's brass, and since privatisation in 1989, water firms have paid £66 billion in dividends. So why then is the country's largest supplier, Thames Water, on the brink of collapse? It's not just that it's £14 billion in debt, nor that every day it leaks the equivalent of 250 Olympic-sized swimming pools from its pipes. And it's by no means the only firm in trouble. According to the industry, water bills may need to rise by as much as 40% to pay for the much-needed improvements to infrastructure. That's despite our water bills rising far faster than inflation or even toilet paper in the Thames. It's enough to drive you to drink something other than water. I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. OK, a little later I'll be speaking to the chairman of River Action, a charity that's hoping to solve the problems in Britain's waterways. But first, our business correspondent, Paul Kelso. Paul, look, why on earth has the country's biggest water company, 15 million customers in London and the South East no less, why on earth has it been allowed to come to the brink of collapse?
Well, the current management, or at least the management until earlier this week when Sarah Bentley, the chief executive, resigned without explanation, triggering this latest crisis. They claim the reason is mismanagement by previous owners who extracted huge amounts of dividends and placed paying out shareholders and extracting profits above investing in infrastructure. Water is perhaps the most controversial of the privatisations. And it faces a triple challenge. If you ask private companies to run your vital utilities, you need them to invest in the infrastructure to ensure it's improved and moves with the times. You need it to keep bills low so that customers pay a reasonable price. But they also demand a profit. So it is worth the investment. It's worth the private money being put into water. Now, that captive market, because water is not a genuine competitive market, you can't switch your water provider. That captive market makes it very attractive to investors, and Thames Water's owners are a mix of pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. They're drawn by that guaranteed income, but it has not been enough. Even though it generates a profit, it hasn't been enough to do those three things: to service its debt, to improve infrastructure, and to keep bills low. The price ultimately it can charge bill payers is set by the regulator Ofwat.
Yeah, OK, Paul, but Thames Water have a choice as well, don't they? They didn't need to hand out the amount of money that they did, millions, billions, whatever it was, in terms of dividends to their shareholders. They could have invested that. I mean, currently, Thames Water is leakier than a porcupine's raincoat.
They are. They have a woeful record on leaks to add to the appalling financial picture. And you're right, they didn't have a choice. But the tacit deal with a privatised water system, which the UK, or England, I should say, it's just England, has had since 1989, is that if you're going to allow private companies to run your utilities, to even own the infrastructure, the argument is they'll run it better than the public sector. They'll generate money for investment. They will be able to turn a profit as a consequence, and that is the trade-off. And it's where that balance has fallen that has caused disquiet from the very start of the, perhaps more than in any other sector, any other utility industry, because there isn't, at least in the energy industry, which has been decimated recently, but there was a market. You could switch providers. You can't do that in water. And Thames has been perhaps the most egregious example of big dividends being taken under earlier ownerships, perhaps more markedly than under the current one, and not investing enough in the infrastructure, which is the other side of the bargain. The focus, and this is where the crucial player is the regulator. That is effectively the voice of the customer, influenced by government. They enforce where that balance falls, and for many years the focus has been on keeping prices down. There's some debate about, depends how you calculate the figures, but certainly in the last few years it's felt like one of the few bills that hasn't been going up. That's because there is downward pressure on price, and no government wants to be announcing or allowing customer bills to go up, but that balance is perhaps shifting when we've seen the public reaction to the consequence of a lack of investment, which is what has been pouring into rivers and turning up on beaches, the kind of stuff people do not want to see when they're out for a swim.
OK, well, let me participate in that debate about the fact that our bills haven't gone up considerably. I mean, a National Audit Office report from 2015 suggests that since 1989, since privatisation, prices have risen by 40% above inflation. You know, we're looking at a history amongst these water companies of underinvestment in infrastructure, of overcharging compared to where inflation has been sitting. And now we hear that they're going to the government cap in hand, suggesting that over the next 5 years, we might all need to see our water bills going up by 25, 30, 40%.
Yeah, and that NAO report is perhaps the biggest corrective to the argument in favour of privatisation, which is it didn't keep bills down relative to inflation. They went up. They have been flatter more recently, and that is forced for some of the water companies, they would say, to increase their reliance on debt. It's the only way they've been able to, because they can't ask the customer for any more money without the regulators say so. They would say the business model is based on debt, but it is quite hard faced with that number. It is quite hard to make the case that privatisation has been a success.
Yeah, just in terms of public sentiment, I mean, I would suggest that part of the reason, or the main part of the reason that the public opinion has turned against the water companies, not necessarily anything to do with the bills, but to do with that raw sewage being put into our rivers and our seas. But I think what perhaps is not commonly understood is that oftentimes the water companies are doing that perfectly legally. Explain exactly why it is that these water companies are able to release this sewage.
We have a system that's not just leaking, but it's creaking too. Much of the infrastructure, most of it was built by the Victorians, an absolute miracle. The sewage system in the UK and in England, it was the innovation that removed cholera from daily life, and it is a miracle of engineering. But for much of the intervening 100 or more years, we've sat back with our arms folded, admiring it rather than doing anything about it. One of the features of that early system is that drainage water, runoff, rain and sewage is mixed in many sewers. That is fine as long as the quantity of water flowing through them is sufficient that they don't overflow where they shouldn't. The issue we have today with many, many more customers, and Britain's population has increased hugely, there is a tipping point at which that water, that mix of water, has to go somewhere, otherwise it will back up into the homes from which some of it is coming. And that's the point at which they're allowed certain conditions to release the mix of sewage and rainwater into waterways, and that is disgusting.
But I mean, it's pretty clear that the problems with the infrastructure are not necessarily limited to those living within inside the M25. There is going to have to be a god-awful amount of money spent to try and upgrade things. Would be a massive, massive project. I mean, it does look almost 100% certain, doesn't it, Paul, that when it comes to it, when when someone is asked to put their hands in their pocket, it will be once again the consumer that will pay for all of this.
You are absolutely right. When it comes to meeting the cost of infrastructure improvements, customers will pay. Very recently, the water industry as a whole took what it said was an unprecedented step and apologised for its failures and committed to spend £10 billion over the next decade on infrastructure improvements. No prizes for guessing who's going to pay for that. Customers through increased bills. But £10 billion, if you'll forgive me, is a drop in the ocean. £70 billion is what the National Infrastructure Commission estimates needs to be spent. And that has got to be paid for either by the taxpayer or by the customer. And this is going to mean guaranteed higher bills for everyone for decades to come.
One in every 4 litres flowing through Thames Water's pipes is lost to leaks. Other companies do struggle with similarly ailing infrastructure, and everyone agrees that upgrades are required. There's just much less consensus around who should ultimately pay. Charles Watson is chairman and founder of campaign group River Action.
I mean, this has just been like a car crash in slow motion. unfurling over recent months. I mean, this is a business that is effectively been stripped of its assets. Previous shareholder structures have taken all of the cash out of the business, laden it up with almost £20 billion worth of debt. And at the same time, it has got an infrastructure that is not fit for purpose, that has not been invested in. It leaks a quarter of its water a year through, resulting in things like hosepipe bans in the summer, and at the same time, last year, almost 70,000 hours worth of raw sewage was discharged into the river, because simply it's not fit for purpose.
From what you're saying, then, it would suggest that there could be other water companies, in a similar, if not exactly just as dire situation as Thames Water.
That is true. I mean, of all across all the water companies, they all now have. I mean, they've all taken slightly different journeys since the original privatisation. So, for example, like United Utilities remains quoted on the stock market, which in theory gives it a much better access to capital in an emergency situation like this. But others have gone through a very similar journey as Thames Water, where effectively private equity type investors and the type of highly leveraged, highly borrowed financial structures that private equity for investors use have been imposed upon them, which rather like Thames Water has left them, overburdened with debt and without the capital so desperately needed to get to get the infrastructure fit for purpose.
Let's focus for a second, shall we, on sewage. I mean, the Environment Agency pointing out that last year, raw sewage was pumped into our seas and rivers 301,091 times, averaging 824 times a day, that raw, untreated sewage is being put into our water. I mean, simply put, why? Why are these water companies doing this?
Well, the reason they're doing it is because their capital structures should have the flexibility to invest, huge sums of basically the bills, the money that gets paid to them by customers in bringing what is in some cases a Victorian and Edwardian sewage system up to modern standards. And the problem we have in this country is our sewage system still combines drainage from flooding, from rainfall, with the sewage system. So when it rains, there is a choice. Either the the system allows the sewage to back up into people's homes and businesses, or they open the valve basically and let this, the overwhelmed system flow into nature, into the environment, into rivers, onto beaches, into river estuaries, or into the sea. um, and the companies do not have the financial capability to make the investments necessary to bring these critical services up to standard. So at a time when the pressures of more extreme climate events is really putting the whole thing under stress.
Aren't these companies being fined for this? Why are the fines not working? Or is it just simply a case, these water companies are making such profits that they can essentially factor the fines into their business model as a running cost?
I mean, this is really the core of the scandal. Is it's not that they're not being fined; it's that they've been allowed to do this. This is what is just extraordinary. Ofwat, the regulator, is supposed to be there to protect the customers, to ensure that these water companies deliver for a fair price, an essential service, both providing us with clean water to drink, and to take away our waste. And what Ofwat also does is regulate how much money, how much profit the investors in the water company can take away for themselves. And clearly, what has happened is that too much money has been stripped out of them by the investors. Too many billions of pounds of dividends, something like about 70 billion, has been paid back to shareholders in dividends, leaving nothing to invest in the system.
Does the regulator currently have sufficient teeth to do what you're asking them to do?
So I think everyone is now in a blind panic. And I assume the reason the CEO of Thames Water yesterday literally disappeared in a puff of smoke, is because she has failed in her discussions with investors to secure the funding needed from the existing shareholders.
Sure, but wasn't all of this just a natural consequence of taking water out of public ownership? Wasn't this always going to happen? As soon as you introduce the free market to it, as soon as you understand that companies are beholden first and foremost to their shareholders, where was the impetus? Where was the pressure on these companies to invest?
You have hit the nail on the head. I mean, this an essential service like the provision of water and the removal of sewage does not lend itself to the private sector. It is a utility. If you go across all the major countries in Europe, none of which have the same problems. I mean, if you take France, for example, I mean, France is going to have the River Seine in the centre of Paris fit for bathing quality in time for the Paris Olympics in 2 years' time. And that compare that with the River Thames in London, which would just be inconceivable. And that is because those essential services have been kept in public ownership. They've been highly regulated, highly protected. If it was inevitable that the water industry should remain in public ownership, then regulation should have been like a clamp around, preventing it from a situation where these companies could be taken over by private equity type investors and stripped of all their cash.
Absolutely, but just on that point, and allow me to pop my devil's advocate bonnet on just for a second. I mean, we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis at the moment. We have the water companies inside Downing Street, inside Number 11, saying we need to see over the next 5 years prices going up by 25, 30, 40%. Why should I, as a consumer, be paying more for my water in the middle of a cost of living crisis just so that you and your friends can go swimming? I am being facetious.
Yeah, look, it's a totally understandable question to ask. The problem being is that they're bust. They are financially hamstrung because they've stripped all the money out. That is the problem. And so if we want our rivers not to have raw sewage, we don't want to get E. coli when we go paddling in our local river, which is what is happening all over this country. We don't want to get sick when we go swimming off the beach. We don't want our kids to get severely ill.
For those who don't know as much about it as you, Charles, just explain exactly the problems that can be caused by raw sewage in volume being put into our rivers and obviously, of course, our seas and flowing back onto our beaches.
From a perspective of our ecology and nature and biodiversity, the pollution of rivers, both by sewage and also by other sources like intensive agriculture, is a disaster. It also makes you sick. We are now documenting and recording all over the country huge levels of E. coli in both in rivers and, for example, at the moment, Blackpool Beach. We're in the middle of summer. Blackpool Beach is closed because United Utilities has got a broken pipe that is discharging raw human effluent into the sea off Blackpool Beach. So it's absolute. This is a public health issue as well as an absolute disaster from the perspective of nature and biodiversity.
Okay, Charles, so what then has to be done? What can be done and ultimately who should be paying for it?
I think more considered analysis that's been done by a number of independent bodies shows that something like £50 billion needs to be spent in the industry in order to get it fit for purpose. It's going to take an awful long time because the water companies, as we can see from the events of the last 24 hours, some of them are basically bankrupt. So they don't have the money to pay for it. And
well, doesn't all this mean that we're going to end up paying for it?
It does. It does. Or we need some really clever people. I mean, there are some really clever minds to start thinking about it. I mean, if I was running DEFRA, what I would be saying is right. I'd be saying right to the water companies. We are going to force sell a quarter of each water company to and put it on the market to green fund type investment companies who could then put in the capital. Now, if you don't want that to happen, then you've got to put in that capital, and something really dramatic and decisive has to happen, and it requires government intervention. And it's a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy.
And since recording those interviews, we've learnt a bit of detail from the meeting between the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, and the industry watchdog, Ofwat. They've promised to do more, to crack down on companies not doing enough to help customers in need. Next year, they'll be publishing binding licence conditions on how to treat those customers and ensure targeted support. Let's see how that plays out. My thanks to Paul Kelso and Charles Watson. This edition was produced by Emma Ray Woodhouse with Alex Eden. Our editor is Daniel Weeks-Chulifia.